Okay, it is good to be back with Paul Moore. I think there's no way this podcast would exist without Paul Moore. That's probably what I should say. Even before podcasting was a thing, you were doing it. back in the movie days.
Oh, yeah. I was, yes. There was some podcasting going on from me with others.
Yeah. Was it even called podcasting?
It was called podcasting.
Yeah.
I mean, this was early early in the days when the iTunes, I guess what was called iTunes Marketplace, launched podcasts.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't like, there were only 5 of us and here we were. I think we were just doing it. But definitely before things like, like the show Serial or something came out and made it huge, or especially now, apparently COVID is like,
everybody has a podcast.
well, and apparently people are just consuming them like crazy. Yeah.
So I mean, thanks for pushing me in this direction. So it's been a while since we talked, and it's been a while since we talked on the air, on the airwaves.
Yeah.
And certainly not in all of 2020. We never made a single podcast together.
No.
And here we are in 2021. So I don't know. I mean, my sense is, I don't know. We have maybe some catching up to do. I kind of want to ask, what's your feeling sense right now? I mean, we're still in the pandemic, but thankfully, although it's worse than ever, California has decided, hey, let's reopen. And along with a lot of other places, which is strange. And I noticed the other day CNN was not posting their ominous death tolls, the ticker. Maybe you don't watch TV. Do you watch TV?
A little bit. Yeah. For different occasions, let's say.
So it's been a weird year. What have you been doing in 2020? And maybe I mean that in the sense of your own psycho-spiritual well-being.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of terrain I'd like to talk about, because that often, maybe that's a starting place. What have you been doing in 2020?
Yeah. No, I'm totally up for answering that. It's not a thought floated through my head, which is like, because you brought up the podcast, existing because of me, there might be some unpacking as to like, why did we do this in the first place? It might be irrelevant. It doesn't matter. I'm just throwing that out there. It's just a mental note.
Like context? I can answer that, I think. Well, the very first podcast that we ever made, we never released because it was basically a lot of swearing and drinking and complaining about fundamentalism, but very cathartic. And then we started making them about the time I was exiting Mars Hill. And I had no job and no prospects, and I was deep in a kind of descent underworld place.
Yeah, and I think it was kind of an esoteric experiment in, because you've been doing so much standing on a stage and giving sermons. It was like, well, what if there was just a conversation that was happening real time, between two people who are largely struggling with the same things, and then what comes out sort of in the moment of those things. And I think they were a lot of fun. I don't know how rewarding they were to listen to, but as far as making them, I found them really
They're
rewarding.
the most downloaded. They're the most downloaded ones I have. They're also the oldest, so I don't know if it's because they've been around a while or if people still like it. I think
this episode will put that to the test.
The least downloaded.
I'm going to take out some Facebook ads.
Oh man. Yeah. And I don't know. And we've also just continued on a kind of spiritual journey.
Yeah. It felt so fresh at the time to sort of, break away maybe from the sense of being, part of an institution. And then it was like, we have to talk about this. But now it just sort of feels like, yeah, that just never stops happening. You know, the path is never, there's no end to it. Okay, here we are.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that might be a way to get, to come back to the 2020 question, like what's been going on in this strange year. Yeah, so for me, I had a good friend that probably a week into the shutdown. So in Michigan, I want to say it was somewhere around March 13 was usually a seminal moment, especially for those of us that have kids, because that was when the schools closed and everyone was like,
right,
this shit is real. And yeah, about a week into that, a friend of mine who's been doing meditation for a long time reached out and said, do you want to do a meditation group? And I said, sure. And I've been sort of meditating in what I would now in retrospect, describe as like a really non-disciplined or really non-focused kind of way. And so that was immediately something that started to really kind of transform like my experience of the whole pandemic, right? Also, I'm one of the lucky ones that didn't have like a huge personal financial crisis due to the whole thing. In fact, the work that we do, so I run with my good friends and colleagues this startup entrepreneur organization, and for several years now we've really been focused on closing the inequality gap and bringing racial equality into business ownership and just people getting cool things off the ground. And all of those things became incredibly relevant very fast as the business community took the first brunt of the storm of COVID, and then everything that sparked from George Floyd's killing, was this next sort of pandemic that swept through the summer. A lot of the work that we do just became very, very interesting to a lot of people. And so, on a professional level, it's actually, we're one of those strange cases in which things seem to be we seem to have more momentum, at the end of the year than we did at the beginning.
By the way, let me just interject here, because I think it's interesting that your organization and the group that you're working with has been wrestling with questions that are in the dominant mainstream consciousness now, like for a long time. Before the George Floyd incident and before all these protests and stuff. And would you say that you're experiencing less resistance to the work that you're at right now, or the work that you're doing right now in the kind of West Michigan culture? Or
so probably a good way of describing it is, I think in the past, if you were to come at it head on and just say, all data points to the fact that there's a massive inequality when it comes to people either starting businesses or owning businesses who are Black and Hispanic versus people who are white. Like that's, as far as the numbers prove out, it's not an issue, right? It's just as some people would say, there's talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. For some reason, opportunity just sort of seemed to come and stay inside of the white community. If you were to bring that up prior to this, last year, I think the general response would be like, yeah, but I mean, doesn't that seem like it's, maybe there's something else. I mean, maybe it has to do with just general income, or that seems like something like that's a good thing, but is that really like the most pressing thing? Or well, maybe we should just educate Black and brown people more about business. And it would sort of just kind of like dissipate into the definitely not at the top of the agenda of any conversation space. And usually like, let's just pick that up later. But then, yeah, I think with this year, it suddenly became, for whatever reason, just, the pandemic sort of clarified, like, there's this inequality is deep and it's across every facet of life. And, we can either choose to look at it and address it in a way that's actually like a sort of a 1-to-1, right?
What do you mean? No.
Well, I mean, like if the problem is having access to capital, then why don't we address the problem with creating access to capital, right? Let's come up with a new financial instrument that's not a traditional bank loan that you can just put right into a business. Or let's just, create something that actually like fits the problem, versus trying to always ask the problem to please adapt to what already exists. Well, what already exists, was built largely by guys like you and me that had a lot of influence and a lot of power, and we understood our own problems really, really well, but we didn't understand what the barriers were for people that didn't look like us very well. So we created solutions that fit us and didn't necessarily fit other people. I'm kind of dialing this back because I know that there's still a lot of like there's a lot of what am I saying? I mean, I think that right now it's still a pretty politically dicey place because there's a lot of none of these things are easy. I think there's some people that are trying to make everything just purely about racism. And I think that the reality is like our country was born with racism. We grew up with racism. It sort of wove its way into every institution and, social layer of our country. But no, it isn't the silver bullet, and if any of these things had a silver bullet, we would have already found it. So there's a resistance to definitely to point to racism as the only problem we have, but then also the pendulum is often then swung the other way, and then it's like, well, let's just put it back in the closet and not look at it. It's like, well, let's look at a lot of things.
Yeah.
Let's just get creative with whatever we have in our hands today to be creative with and try to solve some real problems as opposed to some bullshit problems.
Yeah. Well, this I find interesting. First of all, like, I think, although I just know kind of from a distance, the work that you're involved in seems and is important and is in some ways about the long slog. In fact, maybe 2021 is more of an opportunity to look at some of these things especially if the temperature goes down a bit. Because I don't think the poles, the extremes, have helped the conversation. No. You've got people rioting in the Capitol with Nazi T-shirts on, and you don't know how big that group is. Yeah. But they're definitely dominating one pole of the conversation. And then you have also, on the other hand, you have the Black Lives Matter protests that turn violent and burn cop cars down, or up, and
right.
Looted buildings. And that seems to be, that's not the racial conversation. It's just like a flashpoint.
Right.
And I think people become very defensive one way or the other. Yeah. Like if I don't feel like marching in the streets in a protest, does that mean, I'm a white supremacist?
Right.
Or if I support merit-based economy or something like that, then does that make me a racist?
Right. Right.
And maybe the short answer is, the way I feel about racism is I feel everybody carries a measure of it. I mean, every single person, from an evolutionary point of view, if we could say that out loud more often, I think it's like we don't have to have such a defensive posture. I have racist tendencies that I know of, and I have racist tendencies that I don't know of.
Right.
And both of those matter.
Yeah. That's just called being an American, I guess.
Well, I think it's being a human. I mean,
Yeah.
even when I moved to Israel was such an interesting experiment because not my country, not my place. Mm-hmm. And at first I couldn't even tell the difference between an Israeli and a Palestinian. It didn't take me very long though.
Right.
I figured it out quite quickly.
Yeah.
Using all the metrics that you can think of, like clothing and skin color and accent and the kinds of, I already said clothing.
Right.
And even how one is carrying themselves in public. And it's kind of alarming when you realize that pretty quickly, instinctually, you can divide the world up like that. Say, safe, unsafe, acceptable, unacceptable.
Well, I think there is a particularly malicious kind of flavor to racism in the U.S. and I'm calling it out. I think it's rooted in, going back to like we socially accepted, constitutionally accepted that one race was going to be slaves, and one was going to own them. and I think that a lot of people, I think, can be like, well, that was just a really, really long time ago. But it's like it's if you look at them as sort of a row of dominoes, that go on a table that goes back into 5 rooms away into the house. You may never even feel a need to go back and look at it, but you're looking at certain dominoes that keep falling today that were put in motion. I mean, I often will think about when I was a child coming out of the house and it's a hot July day and there's a very old black man. I mean, in my child's eyes, he looks like he's 80 years old, and he's climbing up and down a ladder painting the house. And there's sort of a childlike sense of like, that's off, like my grandfather doesn't climb up and down a ladder on a hot day like this and sweat. And it looks like, he's looking gray. He's not looking good. And then, I go to my mom and I say, Mom, what's wrong with this man? Like it seems like he needs help. Like, what's he doing? And it's explained to me like, oh, honey, he's working. We're helping him. He needs money for his family. This is a good thing we're doing. Is it a good thing? Well, I think the good thing is probably for everybody to, get together and say, obviously Social Security, if there was such a thing, didn't work out for this guy. He slid through the cracks. But I think that he's indicative of a lot of people sliding through the cracks, but that's a particular kind of explanation that I feel like is unique to us, and that we're, it's not just that we're othering somebody else, which I think every society and community does. It's that we've accepted that something that, on the surface anywhere else will look unjust and broken, broken AF. Mm-hmm. We've been, conditioned to sort of just say, oh, not only is this normal, but it's fine and perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's kind of like in the operating system of how we work together, Yeah. I'm not here to like, I also think, to your point about the protesters at the Capitol, and then those protests that turned, some of them turned into riots, and then some of them turned into like, these crazy, almost like occupations, like in Portland. I think the funny thing is that both of those sides would refer to themselves as woke. One of them would, be wokeness as the slang for this kind of militant political correctness that I find really unhelpful. In these kinds of conversations, because it's not a conversation. It's usually the slap across the face to end the conversation, or at least it's used like that. But then on the other side, I was just listening. QAnon was waiting on inauguration day for the Great Awakening.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
it's a kind of a wokeness. That's what you mean. They're
both
woke
of them
to the
see
truth.
themselves as woke to the truth, and I don't think that it's terribly helpful to come at these things as being, finally the scales have fallen from my eyes and you people are all idiots. As much as I feel like in some ways the scales have fallen from my eyes, but it just makes me feel a lot more sympathy toward those who are like me, and there's a sense of like something's wrong, but it's really hard to figure out what to do. And it's really hard to even get my a handle on like, well, what is it? Because it's messy. It's kind of like
I love what you're saying here. Just in the sense of how, like, what is the problem? And I mean, this is probably what it means to live in this kind of 2020 pandemic, postmodern, post-Trump world where everything is like that. Like, what's going on with religion?
Right.
Well, I don't even know where to begin. What's going on with the global economy? I mean, it's so complex and interwoven, and there are problems.
Right.
And so it's kind of humbling. Maybe that's what's distasteful about wokeness in general. There's really not an ounce of humility in most of the name calling and calling out and, canceling and everything else that comes with it.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, I think we're not, you could say I'm just like a white guy sitting and talking on a podcast. You're a white guy talking on a podcast, but you also go to work every day with other people of color trying to have a conversation about what is the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And as simple as it seems, and it's really not that simple because, I know how difficult it is to sort of build relationships and to really make them like a permanent fixture. But that has been far and away the most helpful thing I've ever done, and not even just as an issue, but as a human, to have I now daily, Daryl Ross too and Jorge Gonzalez are the guys that I run the organization with, and the way that we've set it up is that nobody's in charge. We're all equally in charge, which means we all have to have conversations together. And then there's the relationship of trust that's built up so that, we can have really candid conversations, and we can have really tense conversations. And because there is a ton of tension, even in having all of the best intentions, to cross the divide. It's like the cultures have sort of evolved over time to just be so different that when they come together, it's like there's sparks and there's friction and there's a lot of misunderstanding, and it's a process of being human to kind of like look at it and say, well, in this conversation, is there really a goal in being right, or is there an outcome in being right, or is there, do all the outcomes sort of lie on the other side of just, can we understand each other, and and come to what feels like it's the best the best solution that all of us together could come up with. I feel like I'm describing, what's become like the Sesame Street view of Congress, and it feels like it's extinct or something. But I mean, it works.
Yeah. Another thing that I think maybe is worth just commenting on is what you said about, well, isn't the structural racism like the lack of voting rights and, Native Americans being a third of a person, or 2/5? I don't remember exactly.
Yeah. Is that the 3/5 in the Constitution?
Yeah. But anyway, that was a long time ago.
Right.
And part of me is sympathetic to that because if somebody says you're a racist,
right,
because you're an American and you're white,
yeah,
and and it's built into your system. See, it's right here on the piece of paper. And I think, well, I wasn't around then,
Right.
and my dad is an immigrant.
Yeah.
And, sort of not my problem. So I understand I guess I'm somewhat sympathetic to the resistance to being painted in such broad strokes.
Yes. Yeah. Totally.
On the other hand, something I've learned that's analogous with how I think about the Bible and maybe even what you could call the religious, what's the right word for it? The religious posture that's deep in human beings, which I think there is. So with the biblical text, like I often think these stories from a human evolutionary point of view happened yesterday. Like Abraham, Jonah, Jesus, yesterday. And also the psyche doesn't keep time like we keep time.
Right.
The psyche doesn't say 2021. I mean, so much different than 1890. No, there's no, that's not how the unconscious works. It's not how the collective unconscious works, as far as we know. So the idea that I was watching this program about an archaeological dig with a slave ship, and I thought that was yesterday from the psyche's point of view. And I think that's just worth pointing out that on the one hand, you're right. 2021 is different. I think about my son. He's 16. He has he's in a mostly white school, you would say from the outside, but he has friends that are people of color and from different cultures. And that it's not, as far as I can tell, that's not an issue. He's not thinking, I have friends of color, which that gives me a lot of hope, just in the sense of, okay, things are quite a bit different. We'll see how it plays out. On the other hand, it was just yesterday that we pack people into ships. Yeah. And that's maybe the other side that's equally important. It's like a paradox. I'm saying two opposing things.
Well, I like that framing of the psyche moves really slowly. Institutions move really, really slowly too. But I mean, to put it into context, I mean, my mom in college, went on a date with my dad where, in their own sort of 1968 version of wokeness, went to a Klan rally to see what all these, idiot rednecks were doing. This is in North Carolina. Now, they got there, and I mean, it wasn't more than a couple of minutes before they realized they were around something that was way more dangerous than they thought. And they split. But in that context, it's and then my mom, as a child, she grew up where obviously there was the famous image of the water fountains were colored and white. But also just, racism as the open racism, the white supremacist version of racism, the kind that we freaked out because it showed up in the Capitol, that kind of racism was
it wasn't so hidden.
No, I mean, it was no weirder than saying you were Lutheran. By the way, and that was, that's lived experience that, she grew up in that house, gave birth to me. I grew up in her house. These aren't threads that were long ago, that have been separated. I mean, this is this is part of overlapping lifetimes.
It's an illusion that we have. Yeah. I think from modernism, and I think from certain expressions of postmodernism that were born sort of tabula rasa. Yeah. And
I don't even know what tabula rasa means.
Blank
super
slate.
Cool when you say that.
Blank slate. We're born a blank slate. Okay. And it's all a matter of culture that forms us. It's like the nature-nurture sort of debate. Yeah. But I think a lot of people sort of, without thinking too carefully, have sided with, well, I get to choose, basically. That's the more modernist. I get to choose my own existence. The postmodernism is more like you're born into a culture that shapes your worldview. I mean, it's kind of confusing because postmodernism would say that's also an illusion, but then it's also the thing we should be paying attention to. So there's some, I don't know, irony built in there. But my main point was, it's an illusion. That's an illusion. where there are threads, like you said. There's an ancestry here. There are lifetimes of beliefs and ideas that I think in a way are passed on. They're passed on in the structural systems for sure. They're passed on in the language. They're passed on in the attitudes. And they're probably even passed on in the unconscious, like DNA in a way.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you can't go through radical transformation. I think that's part of the great, speaking of great awakening, that's what's needed, a kind of radical transformation. Yeah. So I'm not saying we're without hope, but I think it's stupid to think, we come in just blank like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, it so reminded me of my parents too, because my parents went to Bob Jones in South Carolina, and interracial dating was banned at the school, and also a sin, which that's important.
I think I heard somewhere it was banned until something like 2007 or something like that. I mean,
that would not surprise me.
It was a ridiculously long time.
That would not surprise me. And
but also, I mean, that kind of stuff. I mean, sorry to cut off the point, but I think there's definitely always going to be kind of like these fringes, where this stuff is going on, and that in some ways is a distraction.
Yeah. Okay. Again, I agree. The extremes take up the fringes take up the airtime right now in a culture obsessed with the urgency of the ticker, the CNN ticker or whatever. Uh-huh. However, I disagreed strongly with Biden and others who were saying this is not our country when they were talking about the riots, because I think that's bullshit,
Right.
It's actually...
If it weren't our country, why is it happening?
Exactly. This is not who we are. No, this is who we are. And that's actually the great task to face up to that. And even to take a careful look at the fringes and how ideology is attractive and contagious, and how mass movements can take over people who would otherwise be relatively civil. Yeah. No, we have to say this is our country, not pretend. That's why it made me so uncomfortable, like, as the Democrats were taking power, the way I really thought it was an opportunity to start speaking differently, to end the dualism.
Right.
But it's the same consciousness, it's like, no offense, but Kamala Harris says now we're unified. It's just such BS. Like, you just happened to win the election. That's what happened. And 80 million people agree with you, sort of. Yeah. And 75 million people don't, or whatever the numbers happen to bear out. So it's like, I think it's better to say, first of all, I don't think it's helpful to say we're more divided than ever. I'm not saying that. Let's go around saying we're more divided than ever. That just, you create the reality that you end up speaking about. However, to pretend that, racism will now simply fade into oblivion because of the Democrats,
Right. Well, we elected the first black president, and everybody just sort of thought like,
I thought it was over.
Yeah.
I thought we did it.
I know. We dusted off our, our jeans or whatever, and
I cried. I don't know why I cried.
It was pretty moving. It's like one of those things where, it's like, wow, that like we did it. Yeah. Who knew we could do that? Mm-hmm. But yeah, something that I was thinking about, and if this is too, if it's getting more into the esoteric and irrelevant, let's just come back to something more interesting. But I also have this sense that like, it's like we take evil, right? We want to see ourselves caught up in this story of like great story between good and evil.
Yep.
And we kind of take it's almost like we take our fears of what's happening, and then we give it this kind of like mythic evilness. It's like here, it's the devil. Like we definitely grew up in homes that were, big into like the devil. Mm-hmm. In all of those wily sort of ways.
That's the QAnon thing. It's like Democrats are pedophiles, and they worship Satan, and they eat children.
but we're all on that continuum, you know. It's
exactly.
like, I mean, so I was just thinking back, you know, about how I think it was like, I don't remember the exact date, but let's say I'm going to throw out a date because it was in the neighborhood. It was like October 11th, 1988, and like Jesus was supposed to come back.
Totally.
And it was probably Pat Robertson or somebody had predicted it. And
just
it was
kidding.
It was so hot as far as like a topic amongst our religious community. You know, I say religious community as if I grew up in a commune. It was, you know, living in the suburbs of Chicago. It was such a hot topic. Like, I didn't do my homework that night. I stayed up late playing video games. I was like, here it comes. Like, second coming. This is going to be it. Here we go. You know, I mean, I laid awake for a long time, you know, thinking like, how is this going to work? Like, will I see the clouds part? And I think he's riding, I think it's Jesus on a white horse. There might be an army.
Totally.
But like, will it happen in Jerusalem? Like, will I find out about it over the news? Like, will everybody see Jesus? You know, I mean, there's just all sorts of logistical problems that you immediately run into with the second coming.
And when we go up to meet the Lord, where do we go from there?
Yeah, but I mean, that's only a few degrees away from Q, and what I just described is only a few degrees more, you know, more radical than those of us who grew up in like more tame homes, but definitely believed in, you know, a heaven and a hell, and like a Satan is, you know, trying to influence you. And even though those of us who sort of like graduated to the more intellectual places of, you know, Christendom or religion, it's still like, I can't let go of that virgin birth thing. You know, I mean, so it's like, I feel like we're all, you know, if there's like 50 ships that are all strung together with a rope, it's kind of like we're hopping from one ship, you know, to another ship, and then way out on the edge you got, you know, the weird extremists, you know, and you got the people who are so convinced that the Lord is returning, they've got a bunker full of like Ensure, you know, vitamin drink and stuff. But I mean, my life experience has been like, I've kind of gone in between a bunch of those boats along the way, you know, and it's like you know, I might have gone, let's say if the middle is just pure, I don't know, logic and reason or something, you know, I spent some time there and then came out into, you know, into where we are now. And it's sort of, I mean, in that sense is, there is kind of a sense of like, we're aware of evil, you know, let's say racism is an evil, right? It was like an institutionalized,
I think it's a good word
evil.
for it. You know, I think actually I was kind of impressed with the Dominican sisters that issued a statement, and they said something which I found particularly powerful. They said, racism is a sin. I was like, oh man, that's a good use of that word.
Like, amen.
Exactly.
We're going to use all sorts of religious words today. No, but yes, I mean, when we said sin, we weren't talking about like 13-year-old boys masturbating, you know? I mean, I think we were talking about like, what are the things that humans, you know, or humans, or maybe better, like social societies, have accepted as purely, not just fine, but just how it works.
The status
that are
quo.
Actually so completely degrading,
Dehumanizing,
and dehumanizing.
Yeah, that's right.
That we ourselves are so, you know, unwoke that we're degrading. You know, we're degrading even just what it means to be a human by accepting. Yeah. You know, that this is just the norm. And I think that's a wonderful thing to call a sin, but it also means that sin is going to be, you know, something that you're going to work with probably your whole life, as far as the work of seeing it, and the work of coming up with like, oh God, you know, what does one person do? You know, what do you use your time for?
Yeah.
How are you going to, you know, end the day with a little bit less suffering in the world than when it started?
Well, that's a stance of responsibility versus a stance of kind of apology or shame, or, I mean, I do find a lot of white people right now sort of falling over themselves, apologizing for their whiteness. And I think something that seems off with that.
Yeah.
Like, it seems like, okay, so then because you're sort of apologizing for whiteness, you get a pass on taking responsibility. Is that it? Or is it, I mean, a lot of it, I mean, I felt uncomfortable with the sort of Instagram craze of the black screen or whatever. I just thought, actually what started to make me uncomfortable. First I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. Like
it's a little too easy.
It is too easy.
It's a really kind of like, I mean, I'm not gonna begrudge anyone stepping up in solidarity. I think I got a statement from, let's just say it was a retail store.
That's what I'm saying. That's where I was going.
JCPenney, and
it was Target.
They gave me the history of Juneteenth.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow.
Yeah.
And suddenly,
Thanks.
Target's super interested in Juneteenth.
Corporations. Yeah. Corporations, Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's where it became kind of a joke.
And
really.
it's like, it is, I mean, again, like there's so much ground to cover, that I'm not going to slap anybody's wrist, but God, I wish what I would really like to see is I would like to see a protest that's all white people all coming up with our own protest slogans that we didn't ask like our black friends to give us, which are their slogans, that we're, this allyship where it's like, well, I'll come alongside you, as you deal with your problem. It's like, no, we created the problem. Racism isn't a black problem. It's a white problem.
How can I help you protest?
Yeah. It's like, well, how about you protest and let me sleep on the couch, for a little while. I'm kind of sick of protesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, but a bit of a soapbox, which I don't want to. Yeah.
All right. So I want to take a time out because I asked you about 2021 or 2020, and you said I started a meditation practice. So I want to try, if you can, I'll try to speak to it too. What's the other side of this? So you've been engaged in these kind of difficult conversations around race and inequality and access to capital and business and in a very specific place in the world, in West Michigan.
Right.
And at the same time, you've been meditating. What a waste of time. Like, why don't you do more posting?
Well, I mean, okay, so here's something that I'll just open it by saying what I think if there's anything that anyone can gain from meditation, it's just simply paying attention. And it's such an undervalued thing to do. So for instance, very, very early in the pandemic, like right around the time I was starting to meditate, as I was meditating, I started to just pay attention to this feeling of being helpless. And that was coupled with a feeling of deep frustration that there are people who have power and influence that are just not using their power and influence to do something when it's like the emergency's here. Like, we're not waiting to find out if the building's on fire. Like, we're rattling the doorknobs and they're hot, so don't open the door because there's smoke everywhere. And so as I was paying attention to that feeling, there was then the sense of like, well, wait a minute, what do I have then the power to do? So at work, this is where it started to go. At work, we had raised a bunch of money that we were going to, get into aspiring entrepreneurs' hands. And it just became really clear, like, wait, we have money, like $300,000. Not a lot when you're talking about pandemic. But so I rallied the team together, and about 14 days later, we had, checks from anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000 into the hands of entrepreneurs, which most people don't realize. Like, entrepreneurs, most of them, especially like new ones, were not at all prepared for what happened. Like, they pay themselves last, they put all their money back into the business. Mm-hmm. This is a group of people that, surprisingly, even though they own a business, were scared about how they were going to put groceries on the table. So it's like we turned that around really quickly, and that money arrived 2 months before I think any of the money came down, through the state or the federal government. And that's a little story of like, these two things are not, it's not like you sit still and get super serene and then you go answer an email. It's like, to know what the action is to take, sometimes, meditation is like the source.
Well,
or meditation helps you practice, really being able to dial into that source.
Well, yeah. Well, what you said initially was it helps you pay attention. So if you are paying attention to your inner landscape and your patterns, and you bring some consciousness to that. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
It's like exercising a muscle, and it translates to you're at work. You're not sitting there, in the lotus position at work, but
right.
You have some practice in paying attention, like what, and also where, when things arise, like from the muse, that's the word I would use, from the depths, like little whispers. If you're not used to paying attention to these things, like the whisper of, hey, we have money, maybe we should figure out a way to get this out to people that need it.
Yeah.
Takes a certain amount of paying attention. If you're only in fight or flight and you're just unaware, which I'm not acting like I'm above that. I mean, 2020 was almost a constant, a daily invitation.
Yeah.
to find other ways of being than fight or flight.
Well, and you don't even have to be fight or flight. I mean, you can be like annoyed and distracted.
Yeah.
It's probably more the common.
Yeah, you're right.
The common state is like, here are all the people that I find incredibly, annoying and ridiculous. And there's plenty of information coming at us to give us those, that feeling. And then there's also just, distracted. I mean, and it's not like meditation is this cure-all. It's just a way of like, it's just a way of, again, just starting to pay attention and realizing when you're not paying attention and coming back to paying attention. And there's so much more to it than I would have ever imagined, and so many more practices than I would have ever imagined. But yeah, I think that, one of the things that, like COVID has done is kind of forced, at least for me, it's forced me into this strange place of like, being easily distracted, not just by something like the news, but almost like, the habits, and like, okay, one day is bleeding into the next,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And nothing seems to be changing. And it's, where you would think like, well, but there's so much less activity, it must be really easy to meditate. It's easier to find a time to meditate, but it's, in some ways, it's harder to go into a real sense of like this moment, that I'm experiencing right now is the only moment, it's the only one that exists, and to like really like inhabit it and sort of have that felt sense of it. It's so incredible, but it's in some ways it's even more challenging when everything, every day just feels like the last one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're saying, I think is kind of powerful. It's like, spiritual practices are meant to be of some assistance with the impermanence of life, the terror of being, the reality that, in an ultimate sense, we're not the captain of our own fate, so to speak.
Yeah.
In other words, they're supposed to work when there's some suffering in the world, but they're often the first to go. When everything is great and you like go to a retreat and you get all fired up, like I'm going to start meditating,
Yeah.
But it's like it becomes, and it fades. Maybe that's the quickest thing to say. So you get to find out what's real and what's not. And I resonate with what you're saying in terms of, I have a boatload of practices that I have committed myself to, that I have experience with, that work that are the first to go.
Yeah.
You know, that's like, I know right now. So for me, like, wanders in nature have been a pretty significant part of my own growth in the last year. And oftentimes I get up and I think, what's calling to me is the moon right now, but my phone is easier.
Yeah.
And, you're right. It's easier to be distracted in a way right now. And I don't think that's going to end too. Maybe it's, in a way, it's revealing just how spiritually shallow my life is. And maybe you could say more broadly, just contemporary spirituality, the state of it, you know, it's paper thin, you know? Anyway.
Paper thin because if it were robust, you would have a lot more stamina to do these practices, or much more will to break away from, you know, listening to a podcast and actually, you know, do the more spiritual thing.
I think spirituality has become another consumer product, you could say. And actually, those who have left religious churches or institutions or faiths often have gone that route. I mean, not that they're saying I'm a spiritual consumer, but they're hungry for something. And so it's like, and there's a little bit of desperation. I've lost my mooring, so I'm going to consume all these things. And there's just something about the time period we're in right now where consumption itself feels hollow, even if it's like the spiritual consumption, you know?
Well, I mean, maybe say a little more about that. Like, consumption itself feels hollow, even if it's the spiritual consumption. What's different about it today than what it was?
Well, let me phrase it differently.
Okay.
And somewhat personally. So when I first started leaving evangelicalism, and I would have said something like this: I was looking for a new home, something like that. And I thought Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Judaism, spiritual but not religious, atheism, Buddhism was really attractive to me. But I thought the problem was I don't have a home, something like that. And so consuming podcasts and books and practices like this, which I by the way, I just think this is part of it. I'm not even against this, saying this is somehow the wrong way to go. I think beneath that is a craving for identity. Like, I don't know who I am, but maybe this external form will tell me who I am. I think that's actually the obsession with podcasts right now, because it's like, I want somebody external to tell me, you matter, you belong, you're one of us, we're in this together. And I guess that's okay on the one hand, but this is where I'm going with it. But an experience of disidentification is at the core of the trans-religious realm of spirituality, meaning the deeper streams of Christianity and Buddhism and contemporary expressions of whatever. It's about ultimately disidentifying. So it's not I identify as a Buddhist or I identify as anything at all. But that's an experience. So that's what I mean. It can leave us feeling somewhat vacant. And when you're feeling vacant, you're at the edge of the abyss, which is kind of right where you need to be.
Well, and it's kind of like, I always refer to, because it's not really of any sort of religion, other than like maybe a Disney religion, even though it's a DreamWorks movie, like the end of Kung Fu Panda, when he finally gets the magic scroll to find out what the big secret is that'll, lead him to defeating Tao Lung, the snow leopard. he opens the scroll and there's nothing in it, of course, and it's like just this reflective surface so that you can only see his face, and it's like it's that total cliche of like, you had all you needed all along. But I think that that cliche is also it comes from something that is really ancient and deep and true. But the thing is, we keep thinking that our brain is going to sort of take us there, and also I think, maybe more importantly, we keep expecting a radical transformation, which is a phrase you used when we were talking earlier, I think about like, racism or waking up or something. And I think that I'm much more interested, and I want the world to, get a lot more interested in just habitual transformation.
Yeah.
Of like, I've got 10 minutes to be aware now. I'm going to, at 6 a.m., I'm going to sit down at my computer and I'm going to write, because writing, for me, I'm speaking also personally, writing for me has always been something that's felt like a marker of like, well, when I finally, have time, or I finally have enough to say, or and it's like, it's almost like the word finally, needed to start getting put down on a Post-it note. I'm making this up, but maybe it's a really good idea. But like putting it down on a Post-it note and then just like, okay, fill in the blank. Finally what? Yeah. Like finally I would write. Finally I would meditate. Finally I would like, start working out, or finally I would, eat a better breakfast. Like it seems like it's more of, just accepting kind of an awareness of what's going on, and then just like stepping into it. And I think that it's probably something that the ego really shies away from, because there's nothing heroic or transcendental about it, and yet it is completely about just becoming aware of yourself.
Well, let me
and your place in this world and your purpose.
Let me try to okay, so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about transformation because I'm working on a new book, and I'm using the story of Jonah as a sort of spine. And I see, I used to think there were 5 kind of phases or stages or something like that, but I think there are actually 6. And maybe the first point I would say is whatever we mean by transformation is exactly what you're describing as a slow process. And I think we do want, maybe it's left over from Christianity, like Jesus will sweep in from the clouds and fix everything. Or I'm going to come up out of the water and, God's going to speak to me and there's going to be a dove and I'm going to be enlightened, or whatever. Yeah.
Or even but I think even on a basic level, I was always taught that I was going to receive a calling. And it's kind of like I would just know. Yeah. I would know when God had called me. And that was, I think, the germ of that, from very early on in life. Like, even it kind of doesn't matter how non-religious or more universal or whatever it is that you do. Wherever you go, whatever you do, you'll find that like these kind of like germs that got attached to you when you were a kid have a way of like, it's like they're in there for a reason. Who cares what the reason is, but like, doesn't matter if I'm studying Buddhism, if I'm meditating, if I'm laying hands on people and praying for demons to come out or something. Like it's still there, and it's asking, to be dealt with. Some people would say, there's people would be like, well, it's coming up from a past life, and other people would be like, it's I don't know, it's the devil, or generational cycles and curses. It's like, I don't care why. Let's just pay attention to it's there.
Yeah, I mean, just to settle in and say, this is a reality that I'm experiencing, and it shaped my kind of worldview early on. Yeah. And it's both maybe attractive and repulsive at the same time, but it calls for my attention, not some sort of pressing down or
Yeah.
or denying or even renaming it as something more preferable to my whatever I think I currently believe about stuff.
Right.
I think I want to say something more about transformation, because something I sort of got from Bill Plotkin, but also from kind of my own musing in my new book. One of the interesting things that he says is that what happens sort of after we have some kind of revelatory experiences, which you can maybe push back on if you want, but let's just call them encounters with mystery, a sense of awakening. I'm going to use a bunch of terms. Numinous encounters, a sense of my life is not what I thought, Mm-hmm. You could call them breakthroughs or breakdowns. And sometimes I think they're the same thing, really. Mm-hmm. And I think human beings, I think everybody, regardless of race and religion and spirituality or no spirituality, have this capacity. But what's happening, in my opinion, is that the ego is getting cracked. That's actually what's happening. Who I think I am gets shattered in some way. Now, what I initially thought, even based on sort of my own kind of revelatory experiences, that I would be transformed. See, I had this strange, inexplicable, wordless experience, boom. But it doesn't seem to work that way. It's like the ego afterwards is still a thing.
Oh, yeah.
And it's almost as if what needs to happen at that point is the ego needs to begin its own process of dissolving and transforming and changing. Instead of getting rid of the ego, it's the thing that needs to be molded. Maybe that's even a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Bill Plotkin uses the cocoon, so like in the cocoon, the caterpillar becomes kind of soup. Let's just take that as the ego, it gets dissolved. And that's the thing that, all right, so I've had these experiences, but it's 6:00 in the morning. I'm working on a book. Am I going to go for a walk outside?
Right.
It comes down to offering ourselves to the process of ongoing shaping.
I think that if the ego were to suddenly dissolve or die or, whatever this kind of like drastic, transformation language is, I think that's what happens when somebody's like a schizophrenic.
Yeah.
It's like losing all connection to a sense of who I am, and then who I am can just become anything in any given moment, and any thought can be real, as it's just passing through my head. But I think that I think you're right. I had an experience, and I think this is quite common for people to have the experience of like, I went on a trip. It was like a spiritual trip. I think we talked about it prior to me leaving. I went away to North Carolina, and when I returned, it was, all sorts of things that happened that week. It was a phenomenal week. When I came back, I was having that moment that you start to, you hear about more and more, especially if you've had it, where I was having that like sense of like, everything, I'm part of everything. Everything's part of me.
Yeah.
Everything just feels friendly and warm. This
is unitive.
Yeah, this is the most amazing feeling. It's kind of, whatever you throw out there is like the grand goal of like spirituality. This is probably, it probably sounds like what I was experiencing. And, I joked that, that was on a Saturday, and I joked that like enlightenment lasts until Wednesday. Because what happened is immediately everything just came crashing down. And it was, I describe it as like a spaceship re-entering the atmosphere, and it's 1600 degrees on the surface of the ship, and all the lights are flashing and blinking. And it's like, and it began a nice prolonged period of crisis. I mean, there were circumstances that were happening that I couldn't get out of, like, work and in my marriage. And then there was also just sort of the inner turmoil. I started having pains, like, and not kind of like the, you know, I mean, these were like, I mean, I guess they would call it like somatic pains. You know, it'd be like I have a feeling, like I feel like, let's say I feel the pressure to really, you know, be somebody, in a moment. Well, I would suddenly notice like that is a lightning bolt up the right side of my spine. You know, I would have a feeling of feeling sad. That would be this like intense pain in like my lower right ribs. And I'm sitting there thinking like, I must be going insane right now. And it seemed like everything was happening, but it was also kind of like okay, here's the suffering that's asking you to just do something, you know, like change. But not necessarily in the, you know, go away and be in the wilderness for a week. It was like, come on, we're gonna really, you gave your wife that snarky, you know, comment again.
That's what it comes down to.
All right, let's go back. We're gonna try it again. We're gonna try it again. We're gonna try it again.
That's what I'm talking about. That it's like the ego has to undergo something.
Yeah.
Just because you have the scales fall from your eyes, like in the Paul story, doesn't mean you don't have a lot of work to do. I mean, it's like 15 years later before he starts traveling around, you know, or to take it more specifically, the scales he's blinded by this experience of, you know, Jesus.
Yeah.
But then he can't see for 3 days.
Yeah.
So it's not like, I think that's just an interesting image. You'd think divine encounter would be like, it all makes sense, but actually it's blindness.
It's the perfect image. It's like, you know, I think Ram Dass said about mushrooms. He said they're an amazing window, but a terrible door. And the concept behind that is like, it's, you know, is that you can see into the possibility, but then when it's over, you're like crash right back, and there's no, you know, it's not the door that you walk through to get to the possibility. The door to get to the possibility, you know, I think that just kind of like day to day, I've got to become really, really interested in making macaroni and cheese for my kid.
No, seriously.
When normally I would be like, you know, spiritual bypassing into a podcast or something.
Yep. I think what you're describing, first of all, I really resonate with too, because, you know, as you know, I've spent a lot of time in wild places with Animus and also my own sort of retreats. And it's an interesting experience. You can easily conclude, well, what I need is to get back out there again.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, that's part of the human. I think we do need a balance. We do need to say no to mainstream Western culture and find ways to.
Well, and let me tack on to that. There's not only the need to get back out there, but the persistent sense that you're doing something wrong when you're not out there, that you're in like a perpetual, a very slow state of failure.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's sort of, I mean, I guess I would call that, the language I would use is a kind of spiritual escapist, you know? And my real spiritual life is when I'm wandering in the woods or whatever and not making macaroni and cheese. But I think, I mean, I got this from Jung. I mean, Jung is saying that the process of becoming more whole is, to put it simply, an integrative process. So the ask is, how much more can I integrate? Which means collecting up more and more and more of who I am, and both internal and external, and the sort of conduit that's between the internal and external worlds. It's like nothing then is off limits. It's like it's not that you can just cross over the threshold and there you are. We have too much experience in dividing our life up like this. And maybe that's, you know, I don't know, maybe we are now trying to answer what's been happening in 2020. Not that we're like more integrated now, but it's just like the ask is, what about this? Okay, I can't go anywhere. You know how much time I've spent traveling? I mean, in the last 20 years of my life, flying here, flying there, speaking here, speaking there, going to the Middle East, coming back. You know, it's like, no, all gone, evaporated, just nothing but, you know, puff of smoke. And all right, so what now? Where am I? Where am I? And what's happening in my world? And is my spiritual life somewhere else, or is it here? Because I've said for a long time, this is a line from my own book, that your actual life is your spiritual life. Well, that's a lovely thing to say. Makes for a great sentence. It's a much more difficult and sort of ego-destroying thing to begin to experience, I guess.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I mean your actual life. This is your spirituality.
Right.
This, if you have spent 3.5 hours down the rabbit hole of TikTok or something, okay, this is it. This is your actual life.
Yeah.
And I don't know. So
yeah, well, and come back to it and ask the question, like, how do I feel about that? Is that something I want to do again? If not, what is the thing I would want to do? and just start over. I mean, like, if you could, God, I mean, if you could pull your kids aside when they're beating the, crap out of themselves for something that they did, and you can just say, like, okay, it happened, it's done. Now let's just start over. It's there's nothing wrong with that, and yet it's like the exact opposite thing that we will do for ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that's the Buddhist notion of the beginner's mind, and still we hear that and we think, yeah, but I want to be the expert, But that's what the phrase is saying, no, the expert is the one that. Yeah. All right, so begin again.
One of the by the way, so with meditation, if anybody's interested in meditation, the Sam Harris app, Waking Up, is my favorite.
Yep, you turned me onto that.
Super great source. Yeah. But so there's a series in there by Henry Shukman about koans, and I won't go into koans. It's a Buddhist tradition, sort of like these sayings that are kind of like come from somewhere else. They're not riddles. They're not puzzles. It's just like something that it's almost like you process them in the non-thinking mind. It's a kind of a way of like, just, I don't know, exercising that kind of thing. But one of the ones is a story about, a master who comes across a traveling apprentice, right? So they're traveling from town. The apprentice sort of traveling from town to town, and visits a temple, visits the master, and the master says, well, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm on pilgrimage. And the master says, well, what's pilgrimage? And, and this is like the moment where he's like, the apprentice is like, I don't know. And
I love it.
And then the master, and this is my favorite, he says, not knowing is most intimate. Which sounds, maybe that sounds kind of silly, but I mean, I like thinking about that when, when we're talking about things like beginner's mind or something. Really just that sense of like, not knowing can be the most visceral feeling of being in your life, in your body, in who you are, and in the moment, because you're not trying to know what's happening,
Yeah. Well, it's sort of.
By the way, I just explained a koan.
Yeah, which you're not supposed to do.
Completely not at all. It doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter what you think the explanation is.
I think maybe just to add to that, I think maps and models are important of the terrain. That's part of what I'm committed to as just a writer, and even these podcasts. And it's good to have a sense of the terrain. Even the koan is a story, Right. So it's like, what terrain are we wandering around in? But that's way different than experiencing it. And
totally.
I love this koan because it's like, well, I'm on pilgrimage, know. Well, I'm what, a spiritual seeker, or here's where I am in the process of transformation. Forget all that. Like there's a lovely story with James Finley comes to Thomas Merton. Maybe I've told you this before, but James Finley comes to Thomas Merton and says they're studying Teresa of Avila's castles. There's 7 castles, and again another map. And he says, I'm pretty sure I'm in castle 4. But I'm okay if you tell me I'm in 3.
Yeah.
I'll be okay with that. And he's like, it's none of your damn business. Go and wash the dishes. That's what he says. It's none of your damn business. And that's precisely it. It's like, okay, maps and models are helpful. They're good to have conversations about. Mm-hmm. It's good to be reminded that there's an intelligence to the soul, maybe to the divine, to the universe, to transformation that we need to be in conversation with, but it's none of your damn business at the same time. It's good to say, I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea. I don't even know what pilgrimage is.
Right.
So where am I right now?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and oh my God. I mean, and you get to the point where you can kind of almost like, you can smell it when people are, they're trying, it's like they're trying to explain everything. It's like spirituality is somehow the code to unlocking everything. And I think definitely we grew up in that kind of space. You find that a lot in people who are willing to get up and preach from whatever kind of like tradition they're coming from.
Yeah. Explaining everything.
But yeah. But it's almost like that never ending thirst that like constantly, seeking, starved mind that's like, there's got to be a reason. And if I can get it and I can unlock it, then I'll
that's
finally
what has
be free.
to die. That's what has to die. That's what has to go into the tomb. That's what has to be swallowed by the fish. And that's a real breakdown and breakthrough at the same time. And you can't manufacture it. It's like, I think about this. I've complained about the Enneagram and fill in the blank with other systems. They're just too convenient. They explain away the world.
Well, it's kind of like they kind of like give it. Yeah, it's like a job placement for recovering addicts in bars and like marijuana dispensaries or something. It's kind of like. It's like an Enneagram almost has way too many tools to just excite the ego into using
the
it.
The ego loves it. It's like, oh my God, finally.
I think it's a really useful tool, but it's so easily.
Well, it's just the ego can get its teeth into it.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that it as much as it can be enlightening, because I found some interesting things when it first discovered it, 15 or more years ago, but it's like, what we were describing before, which is the ego continuing to be dismembered, it can short circuit that. You can come out the other side of your first kind of shock, like, oh my God, I'm actually like this. It's kind of embarrassing.
Yeah.
To, well, now that explains my marriage. This explains my work life. So-and-so's a 1, I'm a 5, blah, 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 blah. And the ego's like, I don't have to do a damn thing,
Yeah.
Now I'm... Yeah. There's nothing worse than the spiritually woke self. And I know from experience, like when you are spiritually woke, it's worse than being just regular woke because you're involving God, you're involving spirit, you're involving, and you can't be touched, it's like, well, I've experienced kind of spiritual enlightenment. You can't even question it,
There's nobody that's better at pointing that out than your spouse.
Oh my God.
Well, and I think like even meditating, which is something which is like, it basically boils down to like think nothing, or better said, like don't really become attached to your thoughts. Like they float through something that seems like it would be, completely designed to not give the ego something to attach to. Mm-hmm. I've had so many moments where I'm like, oh my God. Like there's a meditator that's really like proud of himself for meditating right now and thinks that he's doing like a great job meditating and is thinking about like, what's he going to write about? And it's like,
oh, I've done that a million
and it's
times.
like, who is that? And then it's like, it's like, oh, there's the, that's,
yeah, it's worse.
There's the one who's meditating.
It's so embarrassing. I remember even on I've done a couple of vision fasts, and I remember thinking up points I might make about the vision fast while I'm doing it. I'm like, who is this person? Who is this relentless spinner of bullshit? Like there he is. And I can't get rid of him. I just have to say, there you are, like, I see you now, and I don't really need your help coming up with points that I might make about this. That's embarrassing though. And that's the ego. That's when you first start to see it. You're like, there it is. One of the things, speaking of vision fast, I did this podcast with Pete Holmes like ages ago. And for some reason we got onto vision fast, which he was trying to turn into a mushroom journey. Or he was trying to find out if it was like the same thing. And he's like, well, what did you learn? And all of a sudden it just popped into my head this line, it's like, well, it's a line from a poem. Tell a wise person or else be silent, and this just kind of came out of my mouth. And not that I was like super like my experience is so special.
Right.
I can't even share it with you right now. No, it was more like, just shut your mouth about certain things.
Yeah.
And same with meditation. I'm a meditator. Just shut your mouth.
Right.
Just keep at the work and don't talk too much about it. Let it have its way with you, lest you become the egoic meditator, or something like that.
Because I think what I would love to do, because I would love to, help my children in some sort of way that's distinctly me. I'd love to like get them into a meditation practice, but I think oftentimes what the actual effect, if it just allowing the effect of the work, whatever that work is, to just happen, it's like I should give my son a hug when he wakes up in the morning, and then let's see if I can do that every day. Oh, okay, and then just paying attention, like seems like he's a little bit happier when he's around me. That seemed to have an effect. Is there, do I sense something else that is coming up? I mean, it's just that kind of like really, really just moment to moment, like what's here? Mm-hmm. Am I paying attention to what's here, or am I paying attention to the thing inside my head, which is
the story maker?
I was writing a blog post about, what was happening when I was meditating.
I know, exactly. Or I'm going to hug my son, and I can't wait to blog about this later and tell people.
Damn it, I just ruined it by sharing it on this podcast.
Yeah, well, it just came up by accident, which is kind of a beautiful thing. So
who knows?
I guess my feeling is that we should probably land the plane here. And I'm feeling really grateful for you just and your friendship and I don't know for the way, bringing yourself to the conversation with a kind of openness. And I don't know. So I guess I'm expressing some gratitude, and also I think these kind of unscripted conversations are interesting to me, and about what kind of bubbles up. Mm-hmm. And anyway, so thanks for that. Anything you want to say kind of as we sort of wrap up?
No, I think I love that you created this space. Yeah, I don't know. What's a normal sign off? Like you need to do like a book plug, or you need to...
A normal sign. I don't know when I'll release this, but if you've made it this far, I do have an online program, Lent Descent, 5 or 6 weeks. You can look on my website. It's a small group thing, and there are a few spots still open. But we discuss sort of a map of descent and return using the Jonah story. It's my 3rd year doing it. It's really rewarding. Like, not only does the content still seem fresh to me in terms of like my own teaching, but it's the group itself and the way we hold the content and talk about it, and what people bring from their own lives. So anyway, I found it pretty rewarding. I guess a plug for that. And, everything else in my life in terms of offerings and programs and things like that, that's all still on hold thanks to now 2021. So
brought to you by Moderna and Pfizer.
Yeah. And yeah.
And
I forget the other one.
New one was that they just came out with.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
See ya.